Thank you for attending Policy Matters, conversations about state policy with the Press Herald. This program is made possible with the support of our sponsors.
Grow Smart Maine works to give Mainers choices in how to respond to growth and change. Our mission is to support communities in navigating change by convening diverse stakeholders through advocacy and by sharing resources, all in alignment with smart growth principles. Our goal is that current and future generations can choose to call Maine home while living a meaningful life grounded in well-being and economic opportunity. Visit us at growsmartmaine.org to find out more.
Bowdoin College is proud to sponsor this series of policy conversations on topics critical to our state. Founded in 1794 at the dawn of the American Republic, Bowdoin has always seen Maine as central to our identity and success. Our history and our future are inextricably linked to Maine, a future that can never be taken for granted. We would not be Bowdoin anywhere else. We would not want to be anywhere else. Maine is at the heart of this college.
Good evening and welcome to Policy Matters, Gubernatorial Priorities. In just about 6 weeks, Maine voters will choose our next governor, and whoever that person may be, she or he, will face a long list of challenges, long-term and immediate. Our business projects editor, Coultas, will be sitting down with one of Maine's best-known and most respected policy analysts, Charlie Colgan, to discuss what the priorities should be for the winner of this year's gubernatorial race. We'd like to thank our sponsors and our subscribers for making events like this possible. In the coming weeks, you can expect much more coverage of these same topics in the Portland Press Herald. Our team is listening closely to what the candidates are saying about their priorities, and the reporters are digging into the records of the two major party candidates to not only report what they are saying they will do, but what they actually did during their tenures as governor. So if you are not a subscriber yet, we encourage you to subscribe to stay up on all the news this election season. You can find a link to our packages in the chat or at pressherald.com. And now, please welcome to the virtual stage, Coultas and Charlie Colgan.
Well, thank you, John. That was a lovely introduction. You know, typically when we do a Policy Matters event, I find a topic that I think is important to Maine's prosperity and its future, and I assemble some experts and we have a panel discussion. But for this issue, the idea of gubernatorial priorities, I only wanted one person to join me in a conversation, and that is Dr. Charles Colgan. For many, probably wide swaths of Mainers, and certainly generations of Mainers, he doesn't need any introduction. Charlie has been involved in policymaking and economic analysis since the 70s. He first began working with former Governor Jim Longley and this year is celebrating the 40th anniversary of his Maine economic forecasts. So Charlie has worked for and been involved in the administrations of Democratic, Independent, and Republican governors. And 7 of them altogether, he's had a front row seat in the administration of 7 governors. He is a professor emeritus at the Muskie School of Public Service at the University of Southern Maine and chief economist at the Center for the Blue Economy at the Monterey Institute of International Studies. If you want to get a sense of Charlie's academic work, please look at the registration page for this event, where we have assembled links to some reports and some analyses and some white papers that Charlie has written on topics as broad as energy in Maine, demographics of Maine, broadband, climate change, and transportation. So if you want to get a sense of his academic chops, just take a look at that. But outside of academia and state policy making, people know Charlie for his design and analysis of 9 real estate trends for a product that we call the Merida Index, which tracks and the changes in Maine's real estate industry. It is presented annually at the Maine Real Estate and Development Association Forecasting Conference and has become a very reliable indicator for people who make their living in real estate. So when I spoke to Charlie about this opportunity to pick his brain, he told me there are 3 priorities facing the next governor. And I'm not going to make you wait until this gets the big reveal later in our conversation. His 3, where Charlie sees the top 3 priorities facing the next governor, are immigration, technology, and climate change. So those are going to be the touchstones for tonight's discussion. We will be talking about other issues and examining other issues, but I think we will always be coming back to those 3: immigration, technology, and climate change. So before we get our conversation rolling here, I just want to say a word about our format. Many of you submitted questions when you registered for this event, and we have a selection of those queued up and ready to go when we hit the Q&A portion of this evening's event. But if a question occurs to you during the conversation, please use the Q&A button on the Zoom navigation bar and submit your question that way and not in the chat. We try to keep the chat open for networking and for exchanging helpful information. But if it goes off the rails and it becomes, a political argument, we're just going to shut the chat down. Hopefully we won't have to do that. I think everyone will be engrossed in what Charlie has to say. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to say, John talked about the importance of our election coverage. We feel that's a critical mission here at the Press Herald. And I'm really happy to say that we will be sponsoring and hosting the first of 4 gubernatorial debates with partners at Maine Public on October 4th at the Franco Center in Lewiston. It's at 8 p.m. and we will have, if you have an opportunity to attend in person or to stream it live and hear what the candidates have to say for themselves. But anyway, so that's my opening remarks, and now enough from me. Let's hear from Charlie. And so Charlie, in our previous conversations, you said that candidates will often talk about adopting policies to create jobs, and that's a way that they draw distinctions between them and their opponents. But job growth needs to be considered in a much more nuanced fashion, you said. And so let's start there. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, I think every gubernatorial race going back probably to Joshua Chamberlain has been about jobs. In fact, Joshua Chamberlain was a big proponent of jobs for returning veterans of the Civil War. And that's because historically Maine has been a place with more people than jobs. It has tended to be a place where there were a lot of jobs in the natural resource sectors and the manufacturing sectors, particularly sectors like the forest products industry, food products. The largest industries in Maine were all in manufacturing. Manufacturing made up 1/3 of the economy in Maine. Wow. In 1970. Well, things have changed a bit. We don't have the jobs in shoes and textiles and clothing. Those all left in the 70s. And over time, technology and competition and sheer reduction in demand for the products that we made have shifted the structure of the Maine economy. Maine remains a place that has significant job challenges in rural areas because the rural areas that had depended upon the natural resources industries just have not been able to substitute for them as quickly. But the big shift today is that we have more jobs than people. You cannot walk down the street without seeing help wanted signs, without seeing signs saying, we're paying $16, $18 an hour, far above the minimum wage. I remember we, in the Brennan administration, we had a ferocious months-long argument about raising the minimum wage from $7 to $7.10. And $7.10 was going to kill off the Maine economy. Well, things have changed quite a bit. And now, like the rest of the US, in fact, like the rest of most of the developed world, we are short of people to fill jobs, particularly middle skilled jobs. And that's partly a result of the pandemic. The pandemic was the occasion for what's been called the Great Resignation, which was mostly, it turns out, people over 62 who basically looked at the pandemic and staying home and said, "This isn't so bad. I'm taking Social Security." And Maine was relying on those people to stay in the workforce because they had been a major part of our demographics, because we simply had not had the baby boom generation was the driver of the change since the 1960s. And now it's exiting the workforce, and the baby boom generation simply did not have enough children to replace itself. And there were not enough people who moved to Maine, either from within the United States or from abroad. So we've got a much more acute problem of the labor shortage issue. Now, that does not mean that unemployment will not rise. It will, because we're about to get an engineered slowdown to deal with the inflation problems. But it's a very different environment, I think, in which the struggle about jobs is getting people in and keeping them in the workforce. And we're reinventing the office as we speak. People are still trying to figure out the in-office remote work thing. Employers are tearing their hairs out trying to figure out how to keep people employed but keep the office together. So we're kind of reinventing the entire work situation even as we speak, and that's why I think the traditional, well, I'm just going to create a whole lot of jobs discussion that comes from the governor's candidates, all political candidates to be fair, is kind of not caught up to the point. I should say that every governor promises to create jobs. No governor has the capability of really creating jobs, because that's really a function of the national economy. Here's a number to keep in mind: 0.005. That's the percentage of the national economy accounted for by Maine.
Wow.
0.5%. So the 99.5% of the rest of the national economy is what we just go along. We just surf that wave. And if that wave is coming in happy, so are we. And if that wave is crashing, so are we. The next governor is going to have to face they won't have to face a pandemic, for which we can all be grateful, I hope. But they will have to face a much slower economy than they've seen the last 2021, 22, which has been relatively fast growth. And so the context of the job discussion has changed. And the question is whether the candidates and how the candidates are going to respond to the change discussion, not simply restate the older points.
So let's continue on that theme then for a minute or two. The whole workforce challenge that's facing every employer, I think, in the state currently. Since technology and immigration are two of the cornerstones of the priorities that you see for the next governor, let's talk about the workforce challenges in the context of those two topics, and particularly with the topic of immigration, Charlie. Since so much immigration policy is set at the federal level, what can a governor do in terms of encouraging ways that we can either attract more immigrants and smooth the way for them to get meaningful employment? I'm just curious, how do you see technology and immigration working on that workforce challenge?
Well, technology, what we've seen, of course, with the pandemic was the rise in 2 weeks of a complete transformation of work in the economy for many people who went from reporting to the office every day to staying at home for a year and a half. I bi-coastal. I live in Maine part of the year and out in Monterey, California, where I work at the Middlebury Institute part of the year. I invented all of these trends for remote working long before the pandemic. So everybody's catching up with what I've been doing for a long time. But now, with the pandemic, we've seen a lot of people reordering where they live because the technology allows them to do so. If their organization allows them to do it, people are willing to decamp from Boston and the Boston commute, come up and live in Maine, and essentially have the same job exactly. I have a nephew who lived in San Francisco and now does the same job from his home in Vermont. So that's part of the technological and immigration change is we're going to have people moving to Maine. I think we're going to have people moving to Maine. They're not part of the Maine workforce. They're actually still part of the workforce where their employers are, but that's where they're reported. This trend may have been the wave has probably pulled back some on this, but I don't think it's ever going to go away. I think there's a permanent transformation for a lot of people in doing this. So that's part of the story. Those kinds of jobs, however, tend to be what Robert Reich calls symbolic analysts. They are people who can live and work on the computer. A lot of work can't be done that way. Construction, a lot of healthcare, a lot of service industries have to be done by people making, in the same room with other people, and that's where the demographic feature comes in. Maine, through the middle part of the 2010s, grew only because of international migration. This was primarily the refugees from Somalia and other countries who resettled here. Beginning in the late 2010s, that pipeline shut down as federal policy changed. But domestic immigration, people moving to Maine from other parts of the US, began to pick up for the first time in really nearly 40 years. So we are getting some domestic immigration. We are getting some immigration of people with younger kids who will come up, hopefully, into the workforce. But international migration remains a key part of the question about the demographics of Maine and all of the US. We could probably absorb 10 million migrants without much difficulty in the US economy as a whole. And most people are now following the story of Governor Abbott and Governor DeSantis essentially pulling up migrants and shipping them off to the north. What they're doing Massachusetts and the other states a favor, because they're essentially sending workers into those communities. The whole immigration issue caught up in a lot of race and emotion and the US's historic ambivalence about migration. Every generation of migrants has come in and wanted to pull up the drawbridge. Nothing new about this. It began in the 1700s. So we're in that wave now of opposing migration. The difference is right now we don't have the native population that can fill in those jobs. And so this is going to be a real tension. And I think the governor and the state have to figure out whether they, what their position is going to be with respect to migration. There are a lot of people in Maine who don't want migrants, and maybe those are the people you want to listen to. And there are a lot of people who say they need the migrants to fill the jobs, and are those the people we're going to listen to? So this will be an intense part of the debate, one way or another, simply not only because it's a national issue, but because it has particular resonance in Maine and in much of rural Maine, which is the most desperately short of workers.
So then, Charlie, what kind of policies could a governor enact that would make it more welcoming for immigrants to come and settle here and find jobs?
Well, in fact, we already know how to do this because we did it. We did it with the Somali refugee population who came first to Georgia and then came up to Lewiston and then Portland, and state government and the local governments and local nonprofits and Catholic charities and a whole bunch of social organizations worked together to resettle them, work them into the community, and by and large, they have been very successful in coming to live in Maine. South Portland has a Somali mayor. So you can do a lot if the decision is made to have an organized way of getting people in and then distributed through the country. There's a lot you can do to make them successful migrants and a lot you can do to make them unsuccessful migrants in terms of how much support, education, how much you're able to get their kids into schools and find jobs for them, and so on. So you can do a lot if you're if you want to be an exporting state and getting the migrants out of the way, or you want to be an importing state like Massachusetts and they were sent by the Florida governor, but they're actually in Texas. Migrants and I think they will eventually be absorbed into Massachusetts pretty easily. So there's a lot in terms of not just asylum seekers and refugee resettlement, but whether you're open or closed to migration, and how easy you make it depends on how successful you're going to be in terms of using migrants to fill in the gaps that are there in the demography now.
And so just to close the circle on this, what do you think would be interesting policies for a governor to adopt with respect to the technology aspect of attracting more workers here?
Well, so one of the basic principles in economics is if something is scarce, the price of it rises and people find a substitute for it. So if labor is scarce, we're going to find labor-saving devices to substitute for it. Now, we did that with paper machines. We did it with feller bunchers replacing people with hand saws. The difference is in today's economy, where we are primarily a service economy, what was replacing people are computers and information and communications technologies. And so the difference is that today, what we're looking at is the application of information and communication technologies. We're using one right now to substitute for or enhance service delivery. And this is only going to get more intense as the field of artificial intelligence increases. One of the, I think, beginning in the, if you look at baby boom generation, so the baby boom generation this decade is hitting their 60s and early 70s. In the next decade, they're going to hit their 80s and 90s, and that's still a very big group of people. The people who would traditionally care for them are not going to be here. So we're going to find ways to take care of our elderly population with technology that we're just beginning to see on the horizon now. And I've thought for a long time that Maine was a place where, because we are a labor short state and were that way long before a lot of other places. We could do a lot to learn about how best to employ technologies to help older people, to help disabled people, to help a whole bunch of people we need to get into the workforce or take care of. So I think that's a real opportunity. There are programs at the University of Maine and other parts that are beginning to do that. But if I were governor, that'd be one of the areas. It's an area we don't pay a lot of attention to. Not a lot of states are paying attention to it very much. It's a chance for Maine to be a real leader in technological development, along with other areas in energy and so on. So
you're
an area.
I'm sorry.
So that's an area I'd think about.
And so you're talking about things like telemedicine, being able to deliver healthcare services via.
Well, we know how to do telemedicine. So here's my Apple Watch. It monitors my heart rate, and it can monitor a whole bunch of other technologies. If I wanted to, I can send my health metrics up to the cloud on an hourly basis. What do we do with all that data? Who takes care of it? Who analyzes it? Who comes back with an email that says to me, slow down? That's where we've got a whole lot of stuff that we've got to invent in terms of the technology side. I mean, Apple and Cupertino can take care of the watch. We need to develop the people who know what to do with it.
Interesting. Let me go to the third one of your priorities, and something that you have been really dedicating your life to, especially more recently with the work you do on the blue economy, and that's climate change. I think of climate change as being somewhat of a political chameleon. People will support it in the abstract, but they often oppose measures that are intended to address it. And you, in our previous conversation, you said that mitigation efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are often presented or perceived as drags on the economy. Yet climate change effects and impacts are already being seen in Maine. So what should the next governor do now in order to address that?
The real challenge with climate change is that in order to reduce it, it has to be done globally, which means that I hate to break it to you folks, but your individual choice of an electric vehicle or riding a bike or whatever is not going to save the planet. Maine's contribution to climate change reduction will not save the planet, but it will be a part of saving the planet. And if it is what we call a pure public good problem, if everybody does it, the problem gets solved. If nobody does it, the problem doesn't get solved, but nobody has an individual incentive to make because they can't make a big difference. So a lot of what climate change policy about is convincing a lot of people to make a little bit of a change so that cumulatively we have the effect. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, the effects of climate change are not global, they are local. Mm-hmm. The effects of climate change are a fire in California or a flood in Maine. And if your house is flooded out, you don't much care about the amount of moisture in the atmosphere that was created because the atmosphere is warmer. You just know that you've been flooded out. And so how do we balance our individual responsibilities to contribute to reducing the problem with our individual responsibilities to adapt to the problem? And that's what makes climate change so much more difficult. Also, there's the fact that quite frankly, we're going to have to rebuild a lot of the world. We're going to have to put a lot of solar panels out there. We're going to have to put a lot of wind turbines out there. Maine was a leader in doing wind turbines, and we're going to have to be a leader in other types of wind turbines. If we ever get Aroostook County connected to the grid, because Aroostook County is still connected to Canada, not the U.S. If we ever get it connected to the U.S., Aroostook County, there have been several proposals to try and get a large-scale wind farms up in Worcester County. There are large-scale wind farms out in West Texas. So we're going to have to rebuild a lot of the landscape, and a lot of people are not going to be happy about that rebuilding of the landscape. Here in South Portland, we have a major solar facility, but it's down at the dump, and nobody really cares. We're not going to be able to do that. We're going to have to take up otherwise valuable, what we have been treating as valuable land, and put it into energy production. So there's a lot of fighting that can go on about this, and the problem is we have to do it fairly quickly. We don't have a lot of options here. All of the data that we have indicates that we have roughly maybe 8 to 10 years to make a big difference, and after that, it probably doesn't make any difference what we do, because at that point we may have reached tipping points that are unrecoverable, in the sense that sea levels will rise to, already we're looking at glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica. If they tip over, people in Deering Oaks will be in shoreside property. I mean, most of the Maine coast will be drowned out if that happens. So you want to we've got to keep these tipping points from happening, and that's a real big challenge. It's a challenge because people don't believe this is happening, or they believe that somebody else can solve the problem. And in a sense, they're right. Somebody else does have to solve the problem, but you have to contribute.
So what action can a governor take then? I mean, is it about increasing subsidies for solar and wind farms? Is it
you don't need to increase subsidies for those things. They're already at or below fossil fuel market rates.
okay.
You need to create we're going to have to invest in the grid, moving electrons around. When you had a relatively small number of places called generating stations through high tension wires was relatively simple. Moving electrons around when we've got distributed generators, and we've got windmills in the north and west, windmills off Washington County, solar farms in every town. All of a sudden you have to rebuild the grid for that. And that's going to take some money, and we're all going to have to pay for it, or we're not going to have electricity. As in fact is happening in California this summer, where they have to shut down the grid because of the wildfire. I get emails, I get little notices on my watch when they're going to shut down power at my house in California because of wildfire danger. Fortunately, I'm not in California for the moment. We will have to make some large changes, and one of the big problems we have, and I don't think this has been fully engaged, is almost all of our environmental laws are built to prevent things from happening. All of our environmental laws were written in the 1960s and 70s, when the assumption was that if you're trying to build something, it was polluting. And so all of our environmental laws are written to keep things from happening that would alter the landscape or ecosystems in large ways. But we're going to have to do that. Otherwise, the ecosystems themselves, along with the social systems, will collapse. So I think one of the real challenges for environmental policy and energy policy for the next governor is how to recognize that we've got to make big changes. We need to do it in environmentally responsible ways, which means we can't do more damage from the solution than we're getting in terms of fixing the problem. But it also means that we can't that we're going to have to endure some damage in order to fix the larger problem. And that balance is not going to be easy to find, because most of our environmental work, most of our environmental policy, and most of the way we think about the environment is about stopping things.
Can you give me sort of a concrete example of that? Like, are you saying that we would have to suspend certain existing environmental regulations if we wanted to do something like build a really large wind or solar farm? I'm just trying to
Well,
look for an example.
To take a take an example. So since the 90s, Maine has been the home of a substantial amount of onshore wind, mostly in the western and northern mountains.
Mm-hmm.
Putting them on mountains is a good idea because that's where the wind blows. But in order to do that, we went through a process in the 90s where we tried to plan those parts of the northern Maine woods that would remain set apart from wind development and those that where it would be promoted. We're going to have to do something with the ocean space. We're going to have to divide up the ocean space in a much more aggressive way between fishing, recreation, energy generation, endangered species. We're going to have to find some way other than what we're doing right now, which is everybody throwing lawsuits at one another. That's solving the problem. And the right whale issue with lobsters is a good example. We passed the Endangered Species and Marine Mammals Protection Act because we wanted to stop interactions with marine mammals and endangered species. But now we've got a conflict that we've got to manage somehow differently. And so the current law, which says you have to stop lobstering, isn't much of a solution. There are incidentally, the same problem exists out in California with Dungeness crab. Exactly the same problem. So maybe the federal government's policy and the state government's policy should be finding the technical solutions and the spatial solutions that allow both to exist together, rather than simply choosing one or the other, because we really don't want to do that.
Since we were talking about energy just a minute ago, I'm curious, do you have an opinion on the effort to have state control of our distribution system?
Yeah, I'm not for it. I don't. I think that it is it's a reaction to the PUA people feel about central Maine power, which basically says, well, we don't like you, so we're going to get rid of you. A public organization would have exactly the same problems as a private organization. It's got to rebuild the grid. It's got to have increased reliability. It's got to be able to respond to storms efficiently. And that means the customers are going to have to pay the cost of having the standby capacity. There really isn't a lot of you simply shifted the responsibility from one sector to the other. And I think that, to be honest, and people will not like me to hear me say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is I think a public sector would relentlessly keep rates down and starve the system of investment that it needs to adjust to climate change. A private utility will make those investments because it has to keep it has money at stake in doing so, where a publicly owned utility would simply try to keep rates as low as possible. And indeed, I think that's what a lot of the proponents want us to do. I don't think that's possible with climate change. I just don't think it's possible.
Interesting.
Because a lot of people don't want to hear me say about I'm advocating higher electricity rates. But folks, we're going to have to pay to adjust to this new reality one way or the other. And either we're going to pay with epic disasters or we're going to pay a little bit more to prevent.
Thank you. So since you've been analyzing and forecasting Maine's economy since the 70s, I'm just curious, what kind of policies would you expect from Janet Mills and Paula Page with respect to your three priorities?
Well, I think that obviously the each reflects its parties. Each candidate reflects their party's general perspectives on this. These are two experienced and one has to say very well known people. I mean, Janet Mills has been around as Attorney General and governor for a long time. Paula Page has been governor for 2 terms. So it's not like there are a lot of secrets out there in this race. If you look at their campaign literatures, they're pretty much what we'd expect a Democrat and a Republican to say. Governor LePage continues to emphasize taxes. He wants to get rid of income tax. He wanted to do that before. He's still trying. You don't hear much about that from the Democratic side. Certainly, no politician today will say they're going to raise taxes. Give Governor LePage credit. He wants to blow a big hole in the budget, and he says we'll live with it. Both are very much attuned to the issues of the day. Governor LePage is following the Republican arguments about education and gender and race and so on, which Governor Mills is obviously not talking about. Both of them are interested in, to some extent, in the old standby of consolidating schools, which we've done, and it failed miserably because people don't want to consolidate schools. They want to pay for their own local schools, to which I say, okay, fine. Just remember that you've got to pay for them. One of the things I did notice, I did look at both candidates' websites just to get a sense for what they want to say about themselves, rather than. And one of the things I did notice was that Governor Mills has, and when she talks about the environment, she has the traditional pictures of Maine forest in autumn and a coastal scene, and the kind of images you trot out whenever you talk about the Maine environment. Governor LePage has a picture of the Somerset paper mill on his environment page. Governor Mills spends a lot of time on climate change, and she has done a lot on climate change. She's put together a rather aggressive program in both mitigation and adaptation. Governor LePage barely mentions it, except to talk about energy and lowering the cost of energy, which has been, to be fair, one of his long-standing concerns in Maine. It was an issue he dealt with all his years as governor, was trying to find ways to lower electricity rates in Maine. The problem, of course, is that Maine is, we rely on generally fairly high cost fossil fuels to do that with. And we also buy electricity on a, this is the other thing about the distribution issue. Most of the cost of our energy is sold on a regional basis. Maine contributes to the regional power pool, but we do not generate and consume our own electricity. We generate and consume New England's electricity. CMP is simply it's like saying, we're gonna lower the cost of our food by changing the road. Well, yeah, you can do that a little bit, but the cost of the food is the cost of food. And so it's not a case where we don't control much of the generating mix. We can control more of it if we invest more of it in renewables. So there's lots of opportunities there. As I look at the two candidates, Governor Mills is, obviously paying a lot of attention to the abortion issue, a lot of attention to, the issues of the day as you would expect them to. Governor Page has not paid much of attention to that. So, this is an election in which that issue may play out far more than anything I have than either says about jobs, because everybody says the same thing about jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Governor Page is the traditional Republican view, which is lower costs and we'll have more jobs. Governor Mills is the traditional Democratic view, which is invest in the workforce and we'll have better jobs. Not much has changed. Much more may happen around climate and reproduction policy, reproductive freedom policies than in the past, simply because those are much bigger issues today than they have traditionally been.
Yeah, that
I
will
don't
be.
know. We'll see.
You're right. Exactly. It'll be interesting to see the way that this all plays out as we get closer to election day, and so sort of along that same theme, Charlie. Over the past 2 years, we've examined a series of topics related to Maine's prosperity in this platform, this Policy Matters platform. We've looked at broadband, we've looked at childcare and early education, we've looked at affordable housing, transportation, climate change, and women and aging. And aside from climate change, which is already in your top 3, which would you say is the next most pressing issue to address of the ones that we've covered in this Policy Matters format? Or maybe we didn't hit it. I don't know. Maybe well, there's another topic.
So just to look at some of the topics that you have covered and see how, where are they today? Okay, so broadband, major issue in Maine. The federal government is about to dump more than we have spent in the last 10 years on broadband on us in the next year. So I think that within 2 to 3 years, the broadband issue will essentially disappear off the radar scope with the amount of federal investment that's coming in as a result of the infrastructure bill. Affordable housing. This is a problem nationwide. There have been kind of most of the discussion has tended to focus on some peripheral issues like Airbnbs, taking housing units off the long-term rental market.
Mm-hmm.
In some places, that's probably a factor, but it's not the primary factor. A much bigger issue is housing construction, which has lagged population growth by a lot. And remains intensely controversial. Now, the biggest problem in Maine, frankly, has been the lack of multifamily housing. From roughly the 1970s, early 80s until sometime in the middle part of the last decade, you couldn't build multifamily housing unless it was age restricted. People 50 or 55 and older, and it's because towns zoned multifamily housing out, to quote reduce sprawl, though more dense housing is in fact good for keeping sprawl from happening. What people were terrified of was school children. School children meant money on schools, and so they controlled the school population by keeping the housing stock for younger people, i.e. rental housing, out of town. That's begun to change. There has been a lot more multifamily housing being built these days, in part because of the affordability issue, in part because places like South Portland and Biddeford and other cities, including Portland, have done a lot more to build affordable housing or multifamily housing. But a lot of that's at market rates or even condos. So that hasn't been a big problem. The The big issue with affordable housing, which has not received a lot of attention, is that roughly since the financial crisis and the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, interest rates have been essentially zero, 1-2%. Now, when interest rates are that low, it means you can charge a lot more for the house. So very low interest rates are a way to keep housing prices rising. They keep the asset price increasing because, well, you don't have to pay much to borrow money to buy it. Now that era has come to an end. It has come to an end just in the last 6 months. You've now got mortgage rates going from 3% to 6.5%. At 6.5% on a 30-year mortgage, you can only afford about half what you could afford at 3%. And all of a sudden, prices are going to have to start coming down. I expect that the median home price, which will always remain sticky relative to other prices, that is, it won't come down real fast. But I don't think you're going to see the median home price in Maine increasing at the rate that it has been, and may even fall over the next year, simply because interest rates are now back in an environment where we're pushing down capital asset prices like homes. And all of a sudden, housing is actually going to become more affordable. It probably won't really pick up until the spring season. Interest rates, I expect, will be up until then. Mortgage rates will remain high through 2023. Frankly, if you want to buy a house, now's the time to do it because the mortgage rates are going nowhere but up. And once they get to a certain level, you are going to see affordability increase in a lot of markets. So again, a real problem, things we can do about it. But the environment has changed, and that change in the environment moves that problem into another class. I don't think we're still going to have affordable issues. We still need to build multifamily housing. We need to build multifamily, energy efficient housing, and the Grow Smart Maine folks have done a lot. I was on a panel for them for a couple of years, selecting prize winners in that field. Maine's doing some really cool stuff, but a lot of developers doing really cool stuff with energy efficient, affordable properties from Portland to Waterville. So we are doing this stuff, but it takes a while to move the needle, and that's a big deal. You mentioned women and the workforce. So that's going to get caught up in that's about to enter a whole new phase in some places, or maybe even the whole country if some people have their way, because the vast increase in women in the workforce beginning in the 60s and the 70s, which basically made growth possible, was made possible by essentially the combination of birth control and abortion. By changing the role of women in reproduction, it made it possible for women to enter the workforce in ways that was unlikely to happen prior to that. Is that going to change? Well, I don't know. That's not my forecasting biz. Not going there. The more interesting thing, of course, in the U.S. economy, and again, this has happened in Europe as well. It's actually not the women in the workforce; it's the men. If you look at all the demographics, there are a substantial number. In Maine, it's in the tens of thousands of men who cannot be found, who are known to be in Maine from various population data, but cannot be found in the workforce. And they haven't been in the workforce for 20 years. Now, where are they? They're still around. I mean, I hate to say it, but part of the problem with the opioid epidemic was the problem of men in the workforce. I think that some of the men are actually out doing construction jobs and that are off the books.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a big part of it in Maine, and a lot of them are doing seasonal jobs that are off the book. But the more interesting thing in the gender balance in the workforce these days is the missing men. And I don't think Maine I have not seen anything that has definitively answered the question of what's been happening with that. It's a very interesting problem because, well, for a whole bunch of reasons, but one of which is when you look at people coming along into retirement. So in the baby boom generation, let's call it, men had worked consistently throughout their lives. They'd taken a job right out of high school or right out of college, and they had worked for 40 or 50 years, and they had built up substantial savings and were at the top of the Social Security range. Women came into the workforce much later and had much less Social Security earnings. And so when men and women got divorced or the man died early, the women simply did not have the retirement savings. What it looks like now is that there's going to be a large pocket of men who have also not been in the workforce accumulating retirement savings. And in the 2030s, I think that's going to start to hit. I don't think anyone in the country has figured out exactly what that means or how big it's going to be, but I can guarantee you it will be bigger in Maine than the rest of the country.
That's interesting. That sounds like a good story we should be looking into. It looks like we've got 7 questions already lined up in the Q&A queue, and we also had a fair number that were submitted ahead of time. So let's start taking some of those questions. And the first one I'm going to ask you, Charlie, came from one of the folks who submitted this question when he or she registered. And that is, given that Governor Mills and Governor LePage have very different philosophies around labor and labor unions, what do you think the priorities will be for the next governor around the issue of labor?
Well, labor and labor unions are two different things. They're two different sides of the same issue. We've already talked about labor in the workforce and some parts of that. Labor unions, so that's a really kind of interesting set of things. I should say, I suppose, as a truth in advertising, that as a state employee, I was a member of the Maine State Employees Association. And as a faculty member at the University of Southern Maine, I was a member of the Associated Faculty of the University of Maine. So I've been a union employee up until really where I am now at Middlebury. That doesn't mean I agree with my union all the time. It just means I was a union employee. I think that we are seeing this largely shift with the administrations in Washington. So because the rules of union formation and union management are mostly at the federal level, what you see is under Democrats, you put in pro-union labor departments that interpret the law so as to allow people to form unions. And in Republican administrations, you put in pro-management people at the labor department who make it much harder. And there's not a lot the state government can do about that. I do think that the most interesting thing today is that with labor having much more bargaining power because of the shortage of workers, whether you are, whatever your feelings about unions are, you're going to have to deal with workers in ways that you have not been able to deal with them in the past, when labor was essentially disposable. You could fire people and get somebody in off the street in 2 weeks. That's not possible anymore. And so how this rebalancing of the countervailing forces of management and labor in the current economy will play out with respect to unions, I don't know. I think that Republican governor is going to tip the scales towards management, and a Democratic governor is going to tip the scales towards labor. But what that actually means in the workplace and whether they can have really much influence given the overall structural situation is a very good question.
Okay, well, let's leave it there. And Strawberry, can we take the first question in the queue from the live attendees, please?
Sure thing. What would you say to a governor who is standing in the way of a major research project which would have a substantial impact on reducing carbon?
Well, I think that, as you probably discerned, I am rather panicky about reducing carbon. I think that you'd have to have a really, really good reason for opposing something that was likely to be effective. Now, there are such good reasons. There are. You could have very effective carbon reducing projects that were paid for entirely by poor people, and you really ought to rethink something like that. So I'd want to know, more details and the reasons, but I think you have to have really, really good reasons to oppose anything that's likely to be effective at substantial carbon mitigation.
Let's take another question from the queue, Strawberry.
Sure. What would be your ideal policies around workforce and low-income housing?
Yeah. So, I gave a little bit of an answer to this before, which is first, make it possible for that to be built. Make it possible for make sure that you're not putting barriers in the way. So make it possible, for example, for people to have auxiliary dwelling units, what are called ADUs, otherwise known as mother-in-law apartments. In other words, you can get more people packed into the same space by reusing them. In most places in the country, those are illegal. There's too much density. It's determined that you can't do that. It's too much density, and so I certainly want to make sure that you're not putting barriers in the way. You're not putting zoning barriers in the way of affordable and multifamily housing. I don't think Maine is at a place like California where you have to mandate affordable housing in every comprehensive plan yet, but it's something that ought to be thought about. I don't think you can, the housing market is one of the most complex beasts in the entire economy, and you can't make rapid changes in it, but you can make sure that the changes that do occur in the direction you want them to in terms of affordability, availability, location, and so on, through good zoning and development review.
Let me take another question from the ones that were submitted ahead of time. And there were several questions, but they were all specific to this issue. And we haven't heard a whole lot about it recently, and that's the two Maines. And so what are your thoughts about the divisions between the residents of the first and second districts, as well as within them? And what about equity issues between the northern part and the southern parts of the state?
Well, the term two Maines comes from the report that I co-authored in 1982. So blame me. I did it. It was actually my dear friend Dick Sherwood who came up with the term. So prior to the 1970s, Maine was pretty much the same wherever you went. Portland was a mill town. Portland was it was a shipping town. It was there were paper mills, there were lumber mills, nearby, and it wasn't much distinguished from Bangor. Waterville and Augusta were primarily shoe and textile places, and those were in Westbrook and Bangor and Pascal. So Maine looked an awful lot like Maine wherever you went. But in the years since, the manufacturing industries went somewhere else or became mechanized, and the economy as a whole became much more service oriented. This is true of all of industrialized world. More services oriented meant more people in cities, because that's where cities, bringing people together to deliver services is what cities do. And so retail and services concentrated in cities. And all of a sudden, Portland and Bangor, Lewiston, Auburn began to separate wildly from places like Millinocket and Rumford and Presque Isle. And the two Maines, the first and second district, the two Maines had to do with this, largely with this split between the more rural north and the more urban south. Now, that's not quite a fair characterization, because the first congressional district, of course, extends up into the rural parts of Waldo County, Knox County, Lincoln County. The second district extends down to urban Lewiston, Auburn. Mm-hmm. But the general picture remains the same. But the real split is urban and rural. And this is a problem that is faced in a lot of the country. At the end of the day, the problem in urban Maine is that most of the things that we want today are more easily provided in urban settings. And the things that we don't want much more of are more provided in rural settings. And that's made it tough for rural areas to reclaim or regain the economic activity that they once had. And today, I think the challenge for rural areas, the rural areas have always been the place that people from the urban centers have retreated to in terms of tourism. That remains the case. People are still trying to figure out how to extend the summer season into the fall, and we've done that to a certain extent in coastal areas in particular, but we've done it even in inland areas with developments like the ski industry. So tourism is one opportunity. I think a second, and I wrote this in a report 10, 12 years ago. The other big sustaining industry in the rural areas is healthcare. And rural healthcare in Maine and the rest of the country is the neglected stepchild of the healthcare system. We barely keep a lot of rural healthcare alive. Most of the hospitals in rural Maine have closed. All of them have consolidated into one of the three big systems. So that's been a major problem. Now, there remains a natural resource base. Agriculture has grown. Agriculture has been more vibrant in the last 10 years than in the last 40 or 50 years. Fishing industry, particularly if aquaculture can develop the scale, which is very dicey, but we're doing a study on seafood right now. Seafood industry remains vibrant. It remains the heart of the economy east of the Penobscot Bay and coastal Maine. So there remains a resource base. A lot of the land that we're going to need for renewable energy is going to be out in the rural areas, because we're not going to tear down housing developments. We're going to have to find a way to reuse rural lands for renewable energy. So there are opportunities out there. And then, I continue to think that, so one of the issues that we've been looking at recently is retail. So beginning about 10 years ago, I began to see sharp drops in retail employment. And that, of course, has continued since the pandemic. Now we have large swaths of mini malls and retail space that's gone vacant in much of urban Maine because we don't need it anymore. Does the reinvention of the retail industry towards Amazon or online delivery and shopping present even new opportunities for rural areas where you can now reach national or even global audiences? Stonewall Kitchen's a good example.
Are you talking about warehouse and distribution centers? Is that what you're talking about?
No, I'm talking about Stonewall Kitchen jams and jellies being sold in Ireland, which you can do now on the web.
Mm-hmm.
You can any place can sell to any other place in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean for I think that companies like Mother's Mountain Mustard down in Ellsworth. So what does the reinvention of retail as a global industry mean for retailers in rural areas? I don't think we're talking here about Amazon distribution centers, because by and large those are put as close to urban population centers as possible to meet Jeff Bezos's one-day delivery thing.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't put, you can't do one-day delivery to Portland from someplace with a pit lock. You got to put them close to the urban centers, but you can do a lot with basically now that you have a global distribution network made up of FedEx, DHL, UPS, which now literally is a distribution network for the entire globe, available in all of rural Maine, along with the net. What's that going to do? In 20 years ago, we thought this might happen. I don't think we thought it would happen as fast as it has.
Mm-hmm.
So there are opportunities in rural Maine. They're more difficult to come by, and they're going to take more work. And the whole information communications technology thing is going to have to play a role in that, which is why the transformation on broadband over the next couple of years is going to be so important. And it really is a game changer for much of rural Maine. So I'm much more optimistic about. I don't think the paper industry is not coming back. The J Mill's shutting down. I used to teach up at the J Mill. Those things aren't coming back. But there are other things that can be done. They may be a little bit harder. They may not make quite as much money as easily, but there's more future in rural parts of the state than as long as you look forward and not backwards.
Interesting. You have some really interesting ideas that hadn't occurred, at least to me, before. So thank you for that. Strawberry, let's take another question from the Q&A queue.
Sure. Child care providers are the workforce behind the workforce. However, providers can't find work or pay them competitive wages, which forces parents to adapt to provide makeshift child care. The governor passed legislation that gives temporary stipends, but that isn't permanent. How should the gubernatorial candidates approach this issue?
Yeah, so this is not an area I know a lot about. Childcare. Well, my grandkids are taken care of out in Indianapolis, so I can't speak from firsthand experience. From when my son was growing up, we had daycare right down the street. I think this is a real problem, and it's been a real problem because the question of affordability, the question of standards, the question of what it takes to start and run a daycare business has been caught up in a lot of different debates, all of which, in my view, have tended towards figuring out how to do this as cheaply as possible, either from the public side or from the private side. And I don't really have an answer to this other than to say that the current system, which has evolved as a conglomeration of different fixes to different problems at different times, probably needs to start, a wipe it out and redesign it kind of effort to say, what do we want this to do, and how can we get it to work as in a way that's much better, rather than trying to simply add another fix onto another regulation or another funding stream.
It'll be interesting to see what innovations come from the private sector on this topic, I think, Charlie. I know from speaking with the folks at CEI that they have a program for launching daycare and early childhood education centers, that there's at least one good-sized employer, I think it's a manufacturer, that is opening an on-site daycare because they feel that that's a wedge, that's an attraction that they can use in order to hire people, which is sort of interesting. It's sort of a 1980s idea that's been dusted off and reintroduced. But for them, if it means that they are able to attract younger people and they can retain those younger people in their workforce, then they feel they're way ahead of the game. So we can see where that goes.
Right. So that's a really good example of how the current circumstances have changed the way in which we think about these problems, and reminds us to look at the problems in today's context, not simply fixing yesterday's problem.
Right. Strawberry, let's take another question from the queue.
Sure. How should the candidates address Nimbyism in the affordable housing discussion? For example, the recently shut down affordable housing project in Cape Elizabeth.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Funny, I ride my bike by that project in Cape Elizabeth, and I saw it being built, and I thought, well, that's interesting, and then I read about the opposition to it. I went by it the next day, and I thought, huh? What's the problem here? I think that at the end of the day, local land use is a way for communities to control the way in which they develop, but it's also legally a function authorized by the state. And so I don't know if we want to go as far as California has and mandate every comprehensive plan have an affordable housing designated zone where affordable housing and only affordable housing can be built. Maybe with the shifts in the macroeconomic pictures, we won't need that. But in general, as I said before, most of our environmental planning and other laws are designed to keep things from happening. And that means when we have to change to fix something, we have more barriers than ways of making it possible. And there are more avenues for those people who oppose something than those who support it. If affordable housing is a big enough problem, we may have to rebalance that current set of biases in the law and say, you can, you can oppose affordable housing, but not everywhere. I don't know quite what the answer is. I'd probably be more draconian than others, but I'll let my colleagues at Growth Smart Maine come up with a better answer.
This is a question that came in from one of the folks when they registered. And that is, it's a really sort of a simple, I mean, it's not a simple answer, but the question is very straightforward. Can a single pay healthcare system be implemented in Maine?
I'll give you a simple answer. No.
Okay.
The more complicated answer is the American healthcare system is far too messed up to have a single state try to solve it. Vermont tried and it bombed badly. Now Vermont is only half the size of Maine, but 1.3 million people still can't solve the mess that is the American healthcare system. No, we need to adapt that healthcare system as best we can to what Maine's circumstances are. But I see no hope for a effective, functional single payer system.
Okay, well, that is a straightforward answer. Strawberry, how about the next question in the queue?
Maine is facing the PFAS or forever chemicals issue. Someone is going to have to pay for the cleanup. The DEP has chosen to ignore the risk of chemical leakage from solar waste and telephone poles. These create a huge liability. Shouldn't we be proactive with new technologies?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Back in the 70s and early 80s, back in the 70s, there was a federal agency called the Office of Technology Assessment, which raised exactly this issue. It said, wow, we have all of this complicated new technology. And in those days, the technology was like today's standards, ridiculously simple. We have all of this complicated new technology coming out. Maybe we got to look at the social and other implications of what this means in the long term to figure out whether we should adopt it, and if so, how can we make sure that we get the plus side and minimize the negative side? And the Reagan administration killed off the Office of Technology Assessment in virtually the first week of the Reagan administration, saying the market will decide these things. There is no need to anyone think about it. Yeah, well, not so much. I do think that the PFAS example is a good reason why we do need to think about these things more systematically. I've been touting artificial intelligence and other kinds of ICT as a way to deal with our healthcare issues and our aging issues, and I do believe we will do that. I will believe we will do that because it's going to be essential to do that. But having said that, I also think that we need to be really careful and think through the social, physical, biological, ecological consequences of those technologies, so that we don't wind up making making one system better and making other systems worse. And I think that is possible. And so, I think the PFAS example, classic example of an environmental issue for which the economics of it now creates an almost impossible situation, because it's out there in the environment and nobody has any responsibility clearly under the current law to fix it. We went through a period in the I think this was in the 90s. We had Lust, leaking underground storage tanks, which were gasoline and oil tanks that were made out of steel and rivets and eventually fell apart and leaked petroleum products into aquifers and water tables, but the homeowners had long since disappeared. And the state had to go in and create a special fund to deal with that problem. And something like that may be necessary here, though I understand that there's some efforts at the federal level to do this. The federal government has done this with oil spills in general. But it's a classic example of how you don't think ahead, but that doesn't solve the problem, because the problem then comes back and bites you in a completely different way.
Yeah, so sobering. I know it's really frightening to think about those forever chemicals, I think. Strawberry, how next question in the queue?
What are the economic vehicles needed to address historical disparities based on race, more specifically economic and community development for Native and Black populations who have been generationally and intentionally blocked from wealth creation in the state?
Well, they're different. There are different issues there with different populations. Obviously, with respect to the native population, you have the peculiar legal structures of the relationship between the native tribes and state government and the federal government. And I think, and you also have, with the tribes, you have a level of self-governance that other minority populations don't have, because they are folded into the larger governance structures. I think that there is that you have to recognize that certain populations simply are have historically and in the present been unable to take the same advantage of opportunities as other populations, and make the extra effort to make sure that they do have the same opportunities. I mentioned before the integration of the Somali population. There's a lot of work in that. There was a lot of work by a lot of people in doing that. And, what it mostly took was care, attention, and a lot of meetings. So much of the world has to be done with meetings. But I will not pretend, I will not represent that the integration of the non-U.S. citizen population into Maine has been without problems, or remains, a wholly happy story. Mostly the story of immigration is the most difficulties are faced by the immigrant population. The next two generations increasingly integrated into society. And what we are seeing now is we're still seeing, a lot of the first generation issues. But I do believe that if you recognize that there are some people who are likely to be left out, and make sure they are included, if you recognize the factors that have left them out and make sure they are eliminated, the rest is everybody has to take has to lift their own part of the burden, but everybody's got to have a fair shot at doing that.
Okay, so we had one more question in the queue, and we have 2 minutes left. So let's take that last question, please, Strawberry.
Sure. Should Maine permit the mining of the large lithium deposit recently discovered in Maine from an economic point of view?
It's clear that lithium is a resource of the future. It's clear that places that have lithium have a very important economic asset. But mining is a tough thing on the environment. So I'm not going to say yes or no to that one per se, but it's certainly something that Maine would have to take a hard look at in the context of the global demand for lithium ion batteries, which may shift, and the global supply of lithium, which is increasing substantially now that we know about the need for it.
Well, that brings us right up to 8 o'clock. So, so thank you, Charlie. This was a really interesting conversation. I think we covered a lot of ground, and I think there's a lot of food for thought. I'm hopeful that a lot of the issues that we discussed will then appear in election coverage, and they will be issues that the candidates will be asked to address as they run for the governor's office. I am grateful to our sponsors who make Policy Matters possible. I'm very grateful to the folks who signed up, and I will remind you that we are going to post this recording on our website. And if you registered for this, you'll get a link to the recording and to a summary of sort of takeaways, highlights of our conversation. But most especially, I'd like to thank you, Charlie, for sharing your time and your expertise. When you announced that you were headed to California, every journalist in Maine groaned out loud because we had come to rely on your insight and your plain spokenness. You're able to describe things really well. And I'm really glad that you're still part of the Maine fabric and you still possess great insight and expertise here. So thank you for sharing that with our audience tonight. And thank everyone for I want to say dialing in. Is that the right verb? I'm never sure about these things, but for logging in.
Clicking in. Thank you all for coming. And just remember, I'm not running for anything. This is probably a good thing.
Thank you.